Being able to set a default configuration for Axios is pretty awesome. But what if you actually don't want to use the same base URL for your entire application, but only for parts of it, and for other parts you have a different URL? And the same, of course, for the headers and so on. In such a case, you can do a half measure by creating a cool feature provided by Axios, which is called instances. Let me create a new file, axios.js, in the source folder, so on the same level as the index.js file. There I will import Axios from the Axios package, and on Axios we can execute a special create function, or method to be precise. I'll store the result in a constant which I'll name instance, and again I use Axios create now. This creates an instance of Axios, like a copy of the Axios object you could say, and you can create multiple such copies. Now here I will pass a JavaScript object to configure this and set the base URL. And I'll grab that base URL I also set up in the root configuration. Now in the axios.js file, I will simply set this up here. And now I will comment it out in the index.js file. Now with that, we got one part of the whole thing, but we're not finished. We now got our own Axios instance, and you could of course create multiple instances in different files for different parts of your application. I will show you how to use these instances in a second. Now by default, the instance here will also assume the default setup here, but override anything which it sets up in the instance itself. For example, I could leave the authorization header being set up here, but I also want to set it up for my own instance. So after creating the instance where we can assign the base URL, now for the headers, I replace Axios defaults with instance defaults, headers, comment, and so on. And now here, I can set this to auth token from instance to override it for all requests which are sent using this instance. Now important, we have to export this instance as the file default so that we can use it in other files. And now let me show you how to use it. Let's say in the blog container, where we use Axios to get all the blog posts. Let's say we no longer import Axios from the Axios package, but we set this Axios variable here, or constant, to our Axios instance by pointing to that file, where we export that instance as the default. You can of course also name this Axios instance or whatever you want. I'll leave Axios here so that I don't have to adjust my code down there. Make sure to save all the files, and if you then go back to your application, it should still work fine. Now you will notice one thing though, you no longer see the intersetter printing the log for the request which was sent and the response which was fetched. Because the intersetter was set up for the global Axios object, which we're not using anymore here in the blog container. If I now try to post some post, we even get an error because now the URL is incorrect, because I removed the base URL from the index.js file, I commented it out, and put it into my instance, which I'm only using in the blog container though. Everywhere else in my application, I'm still importing the Axios package itself. So I could of course also comment the default base URL in again, so that we are able to use the Axios package with its default, but also use our own instance in places where we want to use it in our application to override some of the settings for the places where we use that instance instead of the default object. And now we get the best of both worlds. We got our own instance configured for fetching all posts, but for posting a post, we use the default package again, so that is why we also still see our intersetters working here. And of course, we could also add intersetters to our own instance. You can simply use instance, intersetters, request, just like you did it for the default instance, the default Axios object. I wanted to show you this because being able to use instances can give you the flexibility you need in your application. It allows you to control in detail in which part of your app you want to use which default settings. An awesome feature and something which rounds up this module, where you hopefully got a good understanding about how you send HTTP requests and how this Axios package can give you a lot of nice convenience features.